For years, mental health professionals would reference genetic predispositions towards alcoholism and addiction, but there wasn't efficiency to pinpoint those in individual patients. It appears we're getting closer to be able to doing that, and I'm going to now share with you my genetic predispositions based on a DNA test.
I'm JT. I'm in my mid-30s, have a 10-year media career, and nearly a decade of sobriety. So how did another middle-class kid turn into a blackout drunk and a heroin junkie? More importantly, how did it change, and where do we go from here? This is my story.
So it's kind of funny. I reference almost every time I tell my story the scientist proposition. It's my idea that if a scientist came to me and said, JT, we can definitively tell if you're actually an alcoholic addict by hooking you up to this machine, and if it turns out you're not, then we can teach you to use drugs and alcohol with moderation. And I always say I will reject the test because I don't need to know definitively if I'm an alcoholic or addict. What matters to me is the life I live today. The labels don't really matter. So what's interesting is I've kind of done this. It's not as specific as hooking me up to a machine and being able to tell definitively, but now I have a DNA test that shows me my genetic predispositions for my mental health. And to backtrack a little bit on this, again, speaking just strictly from my experience, when I entered into outpatient rehab, my mental health professionals and counselors would reference genetic predispositions because the data had started to come in, that there was science behind this, that there was genetic predispositions for people having these mental health issues. Now, I've referenced before that there is some debate in the medical and scientific community about how closely addiction is linked with genetics and DNA. Well, now we have some more data, some really interesting data to dive into. I am not a scientist. I am not a doctor. I am not a mental health professional, but I think this information is fascinating. So a little bit more background. My full-time gig, my day-to-day gig on the radio, my company has a really cool program called I'm Listening. It's the largest broadcast media initiative for mental health. And as part of this, my company partnered with another company called Genomind. And what they did was they reached out to all of the radio personalities across the country. And this is 1A, 1B, largest radio company in the country that I work for. And they said, hey, we have this company that provides a DNA test. It's called Genomind, to look at your genetic predispositions. This could be a huge breakthrough in mental health, and we're not going to pay you for it. Usually when I endorse a product on the radio through a commercial, I am being compensated financially for that. We're not going to pay you for it, but you're going to get to take the test and get the information and have the experience. And I jumped right at it. To be honest with you, I didn't even dig in too deeply with the information out there about the company because I trusted my company. I trusted if this was going to be a nationwide program that they would have vetted them. And to be frank, I think I can look at these results and not swing too far in any different direction based off the results because I'm a reasonable person. I don't take anything as pure gospel. I'm always weighing all the information together. But that's just a little bit of background. I have not been compensated at all to talk about this company, but I took the DNA test and I think it is absolutely fascinating. So when I went into outpatient rehab, my mental health professionals said, would throw out terms like fight or flight, like this genetic predisposition, that genetic predisposition, but they couldn't say literally, JT, here is your genetic predisposition. They could assume because they're professionals and they have a lot of experience, but we couldn't pinpoint it. And, I don't know why. I would imagine that the DNA test wasn't as efficient and readily available. In the case of this, if this is something you're interested in, I'm not going to link it. I'm not going to directly, suggest that you go check it out and do it. It is expensive. It's about $600 to take it. Again, I didn't have to pay for it. But what you do is they send you this kit. You swab your cheek. They have very strict rules about what they do with your information once they have it. It is, as far as I'm concerned, I trusted where my swab was going and what's being done with it. And ultimately, as a recovering alcoholic and addict, I cared about seeing the results so much that I'm really not bothered about what the possibilities could be about where that goes. But I trust that my data is being protected. And very quickly, you get the information back. And what they do is they send you, it's called a mental health map DNA kit. And you go in and there's several different categories. There's mood, there's substance abuse, there's sleep, there's eating, on and on and on and on. There's social behaviors. And under each category, it tells you, and we're going to go through some of these, what your genetic predispositions are, what that looks like, what the genome is, what percentage of the population shares that. It is absolutely fascinating. Now, before we get into the specifics, I'll let you know there are a bunch of different subsets in here, and the majority of mine came back as normal activity. But it's the ones that weren't normal activity that are ones that dig in, and I'm not even going to dig into all of those in the interest of time. But that's just to say that there are a whole bunch of different things that could come back, like to say if you were to take the test, than if I took the test, and we're not going to have time to cover them all here. I'll start by saying I was certain when I took this test that there was going to be some subset that said definitively you have genetic predisposition for alcoholism, for drug addiction, for marijuana use. Turns out there are some, like there is a alcohol use predisposition, and there is a marijuana predisposition. There's a nicotine predisposition, which I clearly have, long-term issues with all of those. I came back with normal activity on all of those. Now, it's not so specific that it's if you have this type of genotype, you will be an alcoholic, or you're likely to be an alcoholic. It has to do with things like the way your body reacts to alcohol. That could be good or bad, and mine just showed normal activity. So I was surprised to see that. But then when I started digging more, you start to see the things that aren't directly alcohol or drugs, but clearly can lead to a lifetime of addictive behavior. So let's go into some of these. First, I'm going to talk about, I came back with a predisposition for increased habit-forming potential. So you can obviously see on its face how this could lead. It could be other habits as well. It can be good habits, but it can be bad habits like drugs and alcohol as well. Only 12% of the population share this genotype, and the strength of evidence, and I love that they share this, some of the strength of evidence that they use is not that strong. But in this case, it is strong based on multiple studies, including meta-analysis. So again, I'm not going to be able to read the summarization synopsis on all of these, but you can see it shows you the type of gene, and then it tells you, in my case, you're predisposed to increased habit-forming potential, likely due to how dopamine is used in the brain. Again, something that mental health professionals specifically talked to me about when I came in, about the way your dopamine receptors react. They can assume about me, but at the time could not directly say, because they didn't have a scan of my brain, right? They didn't have my DNA. That means you are predisposed to form habits more readily than other people. In psychology, this is known as the dopamine reward system, something we talk about in addiction and recovery all the time. So right off the top, that's a big one. Another one, and this has to do with serotonin in the brain. You've probably heard that term thrown around a lot in terms of addiction. Heightened fear response. Now, fear is not necessarily negative, like the fear, you think when you're watching a scary movie. 44% of the population share this genotype, and it has to do with the amount of serotonin. And another point I'll bring up about this company is you actually get to get on the phone with someone who has been approved to discuss your results with you and talk about this so you can break it down even further. And I'm not even showing you all the breakdowns and references and resources they provide you when you get your information. But this goes back to something we talk about in recovery called fight or flight, right? When an addict is introduced to conflict, you are most likely to have one of two responses, fight or flight. And that can manifest itself in very different ways. And some people may be more likely to fight or more likely to flee. I'm usually the more likely to fight, but we usually have both of them. And in a lot of cases, I will embrace the conflict, but I will retreat from other situations. And so I just think it's so interesting that I have this genotype. It's less than 50% of the population. The strength of evidence is moderate, but this is just something that we reference all the time in recovery. And now I have this information genetically. Lingering guilt, and this is part of emotional regulation. Only 6% of the population shares this genotype. And again, I'm starting to build up a case here. You can see these are all things that could reasonably add up to anyone looking at going, oh, this person has has the things in the mixing bowl that could lead to alcoholism and addiction. I've dealt with guilt my whole life. I thought early on it may come from, being raised in the church or being raised by parents who were quick to analyze me and put me down in certain situations. But it turns out I have what appears to be a rare genotype that leads me to be more likely to have lingering guilt, which may be unhealthy and unproductive, obviously. But look, guilt is something that guilt and shame, right? We talk about it all the time. Guilt and shame are the two of the biggest trigger points that mental health professionals talk about with alcoholism and addiction. They may come from your using and your bad behavior, and they may even lead to more, most likely lead to even more. The next one I wanted to talk about, another one that has to do with dopamine receptors. 41% of the population share this genotype, and I look at this as more of a positive. The predisposition is warrior-like adaptability. In response to stress, likely due to how dopamine is regulated in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter, very important for organization, planning, how we perceive stress. And the variant key to dopamine balance that it is in mine with lower levels of that neurotransmitter. And studies have shown that individuals with this genotype tend to be more adventurous, adaptable to new situations, and may be less fearful of physical pain. So you can see on one hand how this may lead to my drug-seeking behavior early on, and also, I think, shed light on my relative ability to fight through the changes and the ups and downs of living a life of abstinence and recovery. And so this was the one where I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. It's really positive, I have a genotype for low mood and energy. And that, I could have told you on its face, I don't know if it goes to me not getting enough sleep or whatever, but I noticed that myself. And this is why I've been working really hard on my diet, my sleep, etc. This is really interesting. Only 7% of the population share this genotype. And the brain chemical balance of oxytocin, thin-skinned is what they call it. And that's a little bit of a negative term, you think, but I think that's really just the key word they use to describe it. Your genotype is associated with being more emotionally vulnerable. I think that's safe to say. I'm willing to talk about things, open up about things more, analyze, self-analyze more. This may be due to increased oxytocin production or increased sensitivity to oxytocin. People with your genotype tend to be more empathetic and desire social connections. So we talk about people who have struggled so much over the past year with not being able to have real social connections. And you can obviously see by the data how much drug use, alcoholism, overdose has blown up over the past year. And in my case, I have this oxytocin-related genotype that makes people like me tend to be more empathetic, and only 7% of the population share it. Okay, let's talk about another one that has to do with dopamine. Impulsivity, right? Like, again, you look at my history and then you go, well, of course you have that predisposition. Impulsive behaviors, it speaks for itself. And you can trace this back to, I don't really think I'm too impulsive anymore today, but that's because I've done a lot of work on myself. When I was a teenager, I was incredibly impulsive. That led to so many of my problems, specifically with using drugs and alcohol. Okay, now we're going to talk about sleep. This is one of the categories, and this has to do with circadian rhythm. And again, you can see the different genes here. I'm not a scientist, so I can't break down exactly what those are, but the predisposition is to be a night owl. We've all heard that term, and I always describe myself as a night owl, but I thought it had something to do with me. Like, I need to do something better in my day-to-day life to help so that I'm not getting this second wind right when I'm trying to go to bed. Only 25% of the population share this genotype, even though we think of it as being so common. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but may cause difficulty in adapting to a sleep schedule that requires waking up early in the morning, right? Not the best for a morning radio guy. But this goes into how much caffeine I drink. And again, I'm really working on this stuff. I'm trying to turn my devices off earlier, force myself to get to bed earlier, force myself into mood stabilizing things before I go to bed, like reading, journaling, and meditation. But I have the predisposition. So for me, that was good to see. Like, okay, it's not just my actions that are leading to this. I may have a predisposition for it. Another one with sleep is I just have the genotype for having trouble falling asleep. Only 8% of the population shares this. The brain signaling that may predispose you for this, normally when we fall asleep, brain cell signaling mechanisms slow down at the speed which neurons communicate. This allows these cells to rest and renew themselves. However, your genotype is associated with increased brain cell signaling, which can make it harder to fall asleep. I've got it. I have the thing. Now let's talk about food. Another one. Look, you're seeing all these genotypes that have to do with dopamine. Only 12% of the population share this. Emotional eating. I did that video on my eating habits and my view of myself, my critical view of my body image. And look, you may have thought I was crazy because I'm sitting here at 170 pounds soaking wet and I exercise and I eat right most of the time. But emotional eating is a huge part of my life. I eat super strictly, and that's almost in a obsessive way too, Sunday through Thursday. But I'll tell you, last night, I had 2 giant-sized cheesecakes late at night. I knew it was not a good idea. I knew I was going to feel bad afterwards, but I did it anyway. And this is driven largely by how dopamine, again, is used in areas of the brain that connect positive emotions with learned behavior. Dopamine reward system. We've referenced this before. We detect a variant in a gene that affects this reward system, which may be associated with increased sensitivity to the immediate gratification of food. Absolutely. And especially, I think, since I don't have the drugs and alcohol to go to anymore. And this backs up, I was a chubby kid growing up. And look, this has clearly been with me my whole life. Another one related to oxytocin, only 7% of the population share this genotype, and it's to be empathetic. We referenced another predisposition I had that had to do with oxytocin and empathy. I believe that was the thin-skinned one, but this is directly related to empathy. It can be a good thing, but it can also be a burden for those who become too intertwined with the emotional state of other people. You know what I see there? codependency. A huge thing in my family. I always say codependency is in my genes. Well, I didn't really have science to support that, just anecdotal evidence. Now it appears I have a little bit of science. Some other ones that I thought were interesting, I won't dig in too deep. Wary of trusting others. Now, this had clearly shown that I have vulnerability, but this is true. I may be open to sharing myself with other people and sharing information about myself, but actually letting someone in behind the wall, I really gotta trust someone to make them part of my life. I don't mind personally sharing information that other people might not be so likely to share with the world even, but to make you part of my life, that requires some time and some building of trust. Introversion. I could have told you this. I'd love to tell you I'm an extrovert. I think I have portions of both introvert and extrovert, but I will say my extroversion is usually way more first, and my introversion goes back to my drug use and wanting to retreat and put a safety net around myself. It's no surprise to me that I have an introversion, but what's interesting, only 30% of the population share the introversion genotype. It also says that no one is ever completely an introvert or an extrovert, like I was just talking to. We all fall on the spectrum between two extremes. Okay, so that is a little bit of the breakdown. Again, there are tons more subsets in here. And like I said, most of them came back normal activity. For me, I don't know what it looks like for other people and how many came back, above or below the line versus normal activity. And this isn't even all the ones that came back as non-normal activity. But I just find it fascinating. I have already told the mental health professionals that I know about this and recommended it. I'm not saying that you need to go out and do this right away. Again, I'm telling you, it's expensive for the average person, and I got it for free. But I think it's fascinating. I think if this can be part of, or something like this can be part of a recovery program for institutions, whether or not it's this exact company and this exact DNA test, I think it could be a huge breakthrough. And I think it's really important that we all can say now, look, the genetic predispositions are there, and we're starting to more efficiently be able to point to them in the specific individual. So it's called Genomind. Look it up more if you're interested, or just know that this stuff is out there. And most importantly, I think when you start to break this stuff down, you can better give yourself a chance to work through what those predispositions are, whether that's with a mental health professional, with group therapy, or on your own through stuff like journaling, meditation, exercise. Okay, let's get the mail. This mail is coming from Armando Portillo on YouTube. I recently re-referenced the video I did on doing the next right thing because recently I had a bad spell of this. My mind was all screwed up. I had a week where ostensibly a bunch of good things were happening in my life, and sometimes when that happens, my disease tells me that everything's really bad and it can't possibly be this good. Things are going to get bad real fast. It's not real. I don't deserve it. And when that happens, I retreat, right? And I want to just sulk and feel sorry for myself and shut off the world. And that is not good, obviously, because the world's just not going to magically get better while I retreat. So what I know I have to do is start putting myself to work, do the next right thing. And in this case, my problems didn't go away, but I did get some good things done. And I was working on those things instead of sitting in my own thoughts, dwelling and making it worse. So in this case, Armando Portillo asks, what's the advice you can give to people that can't get out of the funk, whatever funk they're in that's keeping them down? First of all, I would say, if you are in such a funk that you think you're going to do harm to yourself or others, please, please, please see a mental health professional. call someone, reach out to someone who is a professional immediately. If you are not yet in that place and you're just in this funk, and again, I don't know anything about you or whoever you may be referencing. I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know what predispositions you may have. I don't know what external things may be going on. I don't know what medication you may be taking. But these are the things that have worked for me, okay? And I've seen them work in other people. Number one, closely examining my diet and exercise. Now, I'm a believer. I don't have all the data to point to, but I'm a believer that the change in diet that has gone on in our country over the past 30 to 40 years, I believe we may look back in a certain amount of years and say that our eating habits may have had something to do, a large something to do, with the growth in mental health issues, with suicide, depression, addiction, etc. So, and I don't even know all the ways this can affect you. You know, you always hear the people, and I don't want to be one of those people. Look, I just talked about, I had 2 freaking cheesecakes last night, all right? It's not about being righteous on the eating. I'm not a vegan or vegetarian. I love beef. It's actually good for you in a lot of ways. I'm not against sweets, anything like that. I love the way this stuff tastes, but there are very clear reasons that poor nutrition can affect your mental health and that good nutrition can positively affect your mental health. And just some easily things that I've done is making sure I'm getting fruits and vegetables daily. Now, I only eat fruits at the beginning of the day in the morning. These are for vain reasons, because the later you have them, the more fat that sugar is gonna turn into. But they're an important part of the diet. And I don't even think I ate fruit or vegetables for like 10 years. That includes time when I was sober, but now it's a big part of that. And then what's the exercise regimen? Look, anything is better than nothing. So even if that's just going outside and having a walk or walking the dog, do it. It is so much better than doing nothing. But I do subscribe to the belief that if you can, if there's not something physically holding you back, I would highly recommend pushing yourself, even if it's just a little bit, with that exercise. Because I know for me, I love to take a walk, but I am not going to get the mental health, physical, emotional health results that I'm looking for just by taking a walk. I have to ratchet it up a little bit more. Now, that's just for me. And then beyond that, what I would ask is, how are you filling your day? For me, I know I have to, like I said, force myself to fill my day. Is that with reading? Is that with a job? Are you out of work? Like, if I was out of work and there was nothing I could do about it, and I wasn't getting other job prospects, I would be just a mess, I would imagine. And when and if that happens, you're really gonna have to see if I can hold myself accountable to force myself into those next right things. But I think of things like exercising, reading, journaling, doing service work, doing charity work, doing positive actions for others that have no direct benefit for me besides the good feeling of doing them. And then beyond that, if I would like to think that if I wasn't getting the job that I was looking for and I was out of work, and again, I'm not assuming that you're referencing someone who is, Armando, but I would like to think that at a certain point, I would at least be able to go and take some work that I may be overqualified for. It may even be demeaning in some ways, but I think you'd be surprised. And I've done this. When I first got sober, I had to take some work that I had previously thought was below me. I think you'd be surprised how much gratification you can get from that. I mean, just talk to someone who has come here from a different country and works at a fast food joint. And you will find a lot of people who have so much pride in their work and getting to do that when we all know they're underpaid, because they're getting to provide for their families. And I think being around perspective like that is really helpful. I'm going off on a tangent, but these are the things I like to think about. How is your day filled? And you may have to really push yourself. You may have to find a community to help push you to get up and just start doing things. You may think, how could this possibly help? I promise you, anything you are doing up and out and about is better than being sitting around, especially alone, watching TV. That's like the worst. I know for me, that's like the worst possible thing I can do. Not that it's not great. It's one of my favorite things to do at the end of that long day. It's a great reward system for me, but I have limits on that. So those are just some of the things I would look at for getting out of the funk. Again, if you think you may be in a position to harm yourself or others, please, please, please see a professional. All right, that's the mail. This one was fun. If you'd like to reach out, I would love to feature your question or comment. You can comment on the video. You can comment when I post these on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. All the links are right here. And please feel free to DM me if you like. If you would like a private conversation, just let me know, and it will stay private on direct message. We'll see you next time. Hey family, if you like what we're doing here and you want to see more, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Share it with someone who you think might benefit from watching this, and feel free to comment below. Love.